Buenas tardes! Today we're going to be talking about the archipelago of Puerto Rico and how the Puerto Rican people got from the island of Puerto Rico to New York City. Now, as a South Bronx girlie, I grew up with all the Puerto Ricans, all the Africans, and all the Dominicans. And so we would always get into fights. So this class made it interesting for me because it made it real for me to finally get to the ground, to the nitty gritty as to why Puerto Ricans and Dominicans would always come at each other. I remember fights happening on the buses, right? And even as a Dominican, right? My parents are both Dominicans and I was born here in the US. My Nana, right? My babysitter who I loved and called her grandma, she was the vecina from downstairs on the 6th floor. Doña Maria Aponte, rest in peace, love you. Right? She was Puerto Rican. She was from the Islas. And I remember her telling me all the beautiful stories of the Islas, of the archipelago of Puerto Rico. So today, we're going to be talking about that migration. How did the Puerto Rican people come from the archipelago, from these beautiful islands to New York City, to the South Bronx? Let's talk about it.
Why is Puerto Rico the way it is? Socially, they're not accepted by the US, but legally they are. Well, this is because of the Supreme Court law that was passed during Plessy versus Ferguson, which voted to segregate the people. Around this time, Puerto Rico had been succeeded during the Spanish-American War by Spain, along with the Philippines, Cuba, and Guam. And so because of this, the Puerto Rican people were affected by the Supreme Court that also passed the Downs v. Bidwell case, which decided that Puerto Rico was a part of the US and it was owned by the US, but it really wasn't a part of it. And so this is where you have the foundation for that socially not accepted, but legally a part of the US.
Yo ni sé nada, pa' que tú estés así conmigo. ¿Cómo fue que terminamos siendo enemigos? Baby, si asume, yo estaba dándote castigo. Siempre he sido a fuego contigo. Tú no eras así. Cuando yo te conocí, siento que yo te cambié. Después que te lo...
You're probably asking yourself, why isn't Puerto Rico a part of the United States? Well, the same Supreme Court that passed Plessy versus Ferguson, which was geared to segregation, is also the same one that allowed for Puerto Rico to be in the state that it's in. They deemed that the Puerto Rican people were an alien culture, and because of that, for racial reasons, Puerto Rico ended up where it's at today. We see here how in Inalda's Llorena's article, how race is categorized differently on the island of Puerto Rico. On the island, it wasn't just a literal black and white. It was about if you were Trigueña, if you were more Indian or more white or more black, and they would look at you based off of your skin tone and your features. And so in the Americas, this was something that was completely different. Now, what does this have to do with the entire topic of migration and resistance? Well, it has to do with everything. Because of this, many people that were impoverished had to migrate to the mainland United States in order to survive. Because the United States had depleted Puerto Rico so much, the island, that the people could not survive on the island with the lack of resources that were available to everyone. There was scarcity not only in food, but also in work. The Jones Act gave citizenship to Puerto Rico. This was in an attempt to quell the talks of independence. Along with this citizenship came, subject to military draft, Puerto Ricans were not allowed to vote, although they did have a representative in Congress. And Puerto Ricans were exempt from taxes on a local, state, and federal level. This allowed for a lot of companies to come and set up shop in Puerto Rico in order to avoid all these taxes. With this, a lot of the companies began to usurp the land, so much so that the Puerto Rican people had little land to produce food to eat on the land. In 1920, the Merchant Marine Act was passed, and this raised tremendously the prices of goods coming on and off of the island. The Puerto Rican people were already devastated economically and trying to survive with lack of land to produce food to eat for all the people. So a lot of the agricultural workers began to start riots, and they combined with the socialist movement. The agricultural workers were organized by Pedro Albizu Campos, who was a Harvard-educated nationalist. In 1934, he organized many strikes with the agricultural workers around Puerto Rico. And in 1936, he was arrested and imprisoned because of this. In March 21st, 1937, there was a peaceful protest requesting for his release. The police attacked, killing 19 civilians. This became known as the Ponce Massacre. The cartoons that we're seeing are creations from Ed Morales and Omar Banucci, who created these cartoons to highlight the history of the colonialism in Puerto Rico. And through these images, we get to see how graphic and violent the history in Puerto Rico and the fight for resistance, for liberation, for freedom is in the country. In 1951, with the state that the island was in, with no food, no land to work on, and no jobs being taken by the industrial machineries, many Puerto Ricans made the hard decision of moving off the island. Like my nana, my titi, she moved and decided at a young age to move to New York and try her luck in the Bronx. Some people decided on Chicago or Miami.
Nueva York. Si te quieres divertir con encanto y con primor, solo tienes que vivir un verano en Nueva York. Nueva York. Si te quieres divertir con encanto y con primor, ¿pero qué es esto? Solo tienes que vivir y este frío un verano en Nueva York. Un ratito nada más. Ey, 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 4 de julio, par de July. Ando con mi prima borracha Rulay. Los míos en el Bronx, saben la que hay. Con la nota en hoy, por Washington hoy.
A number of heroes emerged this morning in a tragic fire at 575 East 165th Street in the Bronx that claimed the life of one man and left 4 other persons injured.
The young boy was leaning from the window, right? So he was saying, catch me, catch me. So he jumped from the top floor, and we caught him. We broke his fall.
But the fire department didn't come until after all the people had jumped out.
Wasn't no fire engines at all. We was the fire engines.
But if it wasn't for the Bronx, this rap probably never would be going on. So tell me where you from.
Uptown, baby.
In 1970s, the Bronx was burning, quite literally. I used to think as a kid that this meant that the entire Bronx was just on fire. But it was a signifier of the systemic neglect. You would have landlords that would either pay people to set the building on fire, or pay little kids, or even drug addicts to set other buildings on fire in order to claim the insurance and cut ties and run away, leaving many people without homes,
And so in the Bronx, you saw in the 70s an increase of this happening all throughout. You saw abandoned buildings every which way. And not only were the landlords abandoning all these residents, but you would also see the firefighters abandoning the residents and these buildings to their demise. And so it would have to be from the community. The community would stand up and protect one another. So you saw an increase in gang activity, and it was for them to protect each other, while everyone else outside of the Bronx saw them as the problem and saw them as the intruders and those who were the ones affecting the neighborhood. But the people that lived here were your average people. There were Latinos, there were blacks, and because they were the most marginalized in the cities, they were looked at this way. If you remember, in the 50s, we had the Lincoln Center being established, and that destroyed San Juan Hill, which was predominantly a Puerto Rican neighborhood. Now, with the destruction of this neighborhood in the 50s and 60s, you had an increase of Puerto Ricans flooding to the South Bronx. South Bronx was already known to have Puerto Ricans. Now this really became the mecca for all the Puerto Ricans. And the South Bronx became a haven for the Puerto Ricans. Not only did this borough look like a war zone because of all the abandoned and destroyed buildings, but even the hospital, Lincoln Hospital, the neighboring hospital in the neighborhood, was named the butcher shop because of its poor care. You had rodents, rats. The building was deteriorated until the young lord, the gangs, stepped in. And this Puerto Rican activist group took over in the 70s, the building. So much so that they demanded better health care for the community, turning the site of neglect into a battleground for justice. And today we have the building that we see today as Lincoln Hospital. But this wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican chapter of the Young Lords, who spoke on behalf of the community after several thousands of people had already been through Lincoln Hospital and died because of it.
They worked. They were always on time. They were never late. They never spoke back when they were insulted. They worked. They never went on strike without permission. They never took days off that were not on the calendar. They worked 10 days a week and were only paid for 5. They worked, they work and they died. They died broke. They died owing. They died never knowing what the front entrance of the First National City Bank looks like. Juan, Miguel, Milagro, Olga, Manuel, all died yesterday, today, and will die again tomorrow, passing their bill collectors on to the next of kin. All die waiting for the Garden of Eden to open up again under a new management. All die dreaming about America, waking them up in the middle of the night screaming, "Mira, mira, your name is on the winning lottery ticket for $100,000. All die hating the grocery stores that sold them make-believe steak and bulletproof rice and beans. All die dreaming, hating, and waiting. Dead Puerto Ricans who never knew they were Puerto Ricans, who never took a coffee break from the 10 Commandments to kill the landlords of their cracked skulls and communicate with their Latin souls. Juan, Miguel, Milagro, Olga, Manuel, from the nervous breakdown streets where the mice live like millionaires and the people do not live at all. They are dead, and will not return from the dead until they stop neglecting the art of their dialogue for broken English lessons to impress the system who keeps them employed as lavaplatos, porters, messenger boys, factory workers, maids, stock clerks, shipping clerks, assistant mailroom assistant to the assistant lavaplatos, and automatic artificial smiling doorman for the lowest wages of the ages and rages when you demand a raise because it's against the company policies to promote spics. Here lies Juan, here lies Miguel, here lies Milagros, here lies Olga, here lies Manuel, who died yesterday, today, and will die again tomorrow, always broke, always owing, never knowing that they are beautiful people,
Pedro Petri's Puerto Rican obituary becomes a poetic eulogy for this migration story. It's not about death. What this poem is focusing on is the lost dreams, the unfulfilled promises, and the invisible labor behind the Puerto Ricans in the US and what they're contributing specifically in New York. His work ties together the struggles of survival, of cultural pride of the Puerto Rican people. To conclude, I really loved taking this class and I got to learn a lot about Puerto Rico and I got to debunk a lot of myths. As I said in the beginning, I would see as a Dominican, right? I would see a lot of fights between Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and I couldn't understand why. My cousins were half Dominicans. My titi, who was my babysitter, was also Puerto Rican. So I didn't understand why the arguments would happen. After taking this class, I got to understand the deep rooted love and relationship between Dominicans and Puerto Ricans. And so today, quite honestly, I'm still confused as to how or at what point did ever become a competition. But honestly, thinking about it, I think it's rooted in the colonizing structures that we live here in the United States. If we think about it, the United States is a Eurocentric mentality of colonialization, and that in turn affected Puerto Rico, and that's why we have Puerto Ricans here, right? And so it was to marginalize a lot of people and people specifically of color. These colonial structures aren't meant for us, people that look like us. It's meant to marginalize us, and it's meant to pit us against each other. And so I think that's exactly what happened. That we allowed ourselves to be marginalized, allowed ourselves to que se nos coma el cerebro with all these colonizing structures and to be pitted against each other. Dominicans and Puerto Ricans should not fight. We have more in common than we do have differences. And it's not a competition. We have to remember, if we look back in history, and which was the part that I love, that Dominicans were helping Puerto Ricans and vice versa. Why? Our islands are right next to each other. It only makes sense. And so what I've learned from this class is quite a lot. I not only learned about the history of Puerto Rico and relationship to the Dominican Republic, but I also got to learn about how Puerto Ricans from the island got to New York. And I love that, most especially because it focuses on the Bronx. I was always curious as to what the Bronx looked like in the 70s, in the 80s, and even in the 1900s. And it was my aha moment to see and hear and learn that Puerto Ricans were here in the 1900s and they were impacting, there were Latinos. Often enough times we always hear the black and the white about history, but we never hear about Latinos. We never hear the brown version, quote unquote, of history, right? And so more and more as I progress in my college time, I get to hear more about us. And that was always a question for me as a young Latina sitting in school. But what about me? Enough about the African Americans and the white, but what about people that look like me? We must have been here in this country.
Soy yo.